Trump says no deadline for Iran deal. Iran says open to dialogue, warns blockades and threats hinder talks. And UN says diplomacy on sustainable path to resolve Lebanon-Israel conflict.
The United States military began major combat operations in Iran.
קרא משטר הרשע באיראן, מוות לישראל, מוות לאמריקה.
U.S. President Donald Trump says there is no deadline for Iran to reach a deal, and he is not rushing negotiations. Trump added that reports of a 3 to 5 day deadline for Iran to reach a deal are not accurate. In remarks to Fox TV News, Trump said there is no time pressure on extending the ceasefire and that he is not rushing negotiations. He added that his goal is to secure what he described as the best possible agreement, stating that military pressure, including maritime measures, has a greater impact than airstrikes.
But for you to win, I know how difficult it is, so congratulations to all very much. This was the school's record.
Iran says it remains open to dialogue, but warns that blockades and threats are blocking progress in negotiations. President Masoud Pezeshkian said breaches of commitments and pressure tactics are the main obstacles to meaningful talks, criticizing what he described as contradicting in U.S. policy. Parliament Speaker Mohammed Baker Kalibaf added that any ceasefire must include an end to maritime blockades and military actions, warning the Strait of Hormuz cannot reopen under continued violations. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said the current tensions in the Strait are a direct result of U.S. and Israeli strikes, underscoring Tehran's hardening stance as negotiations remain uncertain. UN Secretary General candidate Macky Sall is calling for a more active international role to sustain the ceasefire and advance peace efforts. Speaking to reporters, Sall urged support for Pakistan's mediation and called on all parties to work towards a lasting agreement. He stressed that diplomacy, not military escalation, is the only path forward, saying the priority must be reaching a definitive deal to ensure stability in the region. The White House said that U.S. President Donald Trump wants a unified response from Iran's leadership to U.S. proposal to end the conflict. White House spokesperson said the U.S. President Donald Trump is seeking a unified response from Iran's leadership to the United States proposals aiming at ending the fighting. Speaking to reporters and in remarks to Fox News, she added that no deadline has been set for extending the ceasefire announced earlier this week. She also stressed that Iran is expecting to agree to transferring enriched uranium to the United States as part of negotiations to end the war. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky has warned that Iran war could threaten access to U.S. missile defense systems, citing production limits. Ukrainian President said a prolonged Iran war could increase risks to Ukraine's access to U.S. missile defense systems. In an interview with CNN, Zelensky added that Ukraine has received limited quantities due to U.S. production constraints, though supply and intelligence sharing remain intact for now. He also added that Kiev is secured weapons through NATO-backed foundation mechanisms, but warned that continued escalation could threaten future deliveries. Iranian state media has released videos that shows the Revolutionary Guard intercepting 2 cargo ships near the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian state media reported that the Revolutionary Guard Corps intercepted and seized 2 cargo vessels near the Strait of Hormuz. According to the New York Times, the ships seen in the footage matched those names, with images showing an Iranian-flagged speedboat approaching the vessels. The video also shows armed personnel boarding the ships using ladders in what appears to be a coordinated maritime operation. U.S. officials said that clearing mines from the Strait of Hormuz after the Iran war could take up to 6 months. The Washington Post and CNN reported that Pentagon officials have told U.S. lawmakers that clearing mines from the Strait of Hormuz could take around 6 months after the conflict ends. According to sources, the assessment was shared during a classified briefing to the House Armed Services Committee earlier this week. To further unpack the situation, we now move on to my dear colleague Reham Morsi in our newsroom. Reham.
Thank you so much, Rana. Good morning to you and all our viewers. We are joined from Brussels by Camilla Zarakata, Romanowska, an EU law professor. Thank you for joining us this morning here on Qnews. Professor Camilla, let's start off by asking about how international law assesses the legality of these naval blockades, like the one that's currently imposed on the Strait of Hormuz, especially that now it's impacting global trade.
Well, the present legal debate begins with the oldest modern question in international law: when may force lawfully be used across the borders? Well, under Article 2.4 of UN Charter, states must refrain from the threat of use of the threat or use of the force against territorial integrity or political independence of another state. U.S. strikes or special operations on Iranian territory therefore require a recognized legal basis. Washington would typically rely on one of the three arguments: self-defense under the Article 51, but we need to satisfy necessity, proportionality, immediacy, and nexus of the threat; collective self-defense, consent. And the core controversy now would be whether the strikes would prevent rather than response.
The thing is, Professor, is that they're both blockading the strait now. Both sides are blockading the strait. How can they both claim a legality of doing these actions?
Well, the thing is that we have to look at the very important thing, which is some San Remo manual from 1994. It means that we need to take into account customary law, which is formally declared, notified, effectively enforced, and non-discriminatory between neutral states. The proportionate of military objective and humanitarian effect needs to take place, as well as designation to staff civilians. The thing is with the Hormuz is that under the legal regime, which is state principle in United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, and especially Article 37 and 44, the straight use of international obligation, we need to see here the key concept of international maritime law, which is transit passage. This gives ships and aircraft of all states, I have to have all states, the right of continuous and expeditious movement through the strait. Unlike innocent passengers, transit passes cannot simply be suspended from political reason, and this is actually what's happening now. When we talk about the coastal states, well, they can navigate navigation safety, pollution prevention, traffic, with separation schemes, custom and security procedures consistent with international law, but they may not obstruct passage arbitrarily or use regulation as a distinguished closure. Under the states and the user states have also duties. The vessels must comply with accepted navigation rules and refrain from threats or hostile acts inconsistent with UN Charter. So if the strait becomes unsafe due to the airstrike, attacks, mines, seizure, or harassment, states may cooperate through escorts, surveillance, demining, and maritime security missions.
I'm glad you brought that up, Professor. Now, you're saying that this is a right, a freedom of access to international waters. Now, if the strait does remain restricted due to the blockade from the US and Iran, what legal obligations do states have actually under international maritime law to ensure the freedom of navigation? What can they do other than escort these civilian ships through the strait?
Well, first of all, we have to see the very important things that, under the maritime law, international maritime law, there is some a concept of ensuring a freedom of navigation. This is exactly the part 3 of the United Nations Convention of Law of the Sea, Article 37 to 44, that regarding the Strait of International Navigation. That means that the vessel and aircraft of all states enjoy the right of continuous and expeditious passage between one part of the high sea or exclusive economic zone on another. Coastal states, as I say, may only regulate safety and traffic or pollution aspects, maybe custom as well, but they cannot suspend transit passage at political convenience and impose the payment. User state has the obligations I already mentioned to basically act within the act lawfully without threat of force. But if the strait becomes dangerous through, as I said, attacks on mines, this is something which we actually can act on the maritime security to coordinate maritime security measure and escorts and deconflication patrols, for instance. And this is something which is as well seen in the Charter of Law of United Charter and the Law of the Sea, because the geography indeed gives leverage, but United Nations Convention of Law of the Sea exists so narrow waters do not become a narrow politics. This is something we truly want to prevent, to incorporate a politics of threat within the maritime global security and navigation. This is something we're truly trying to avoid with quite straight course. And unfortunately, the situation from both sides seems very dubious from international law of the sea and international law principles as well.
Okay, if we can talk a bit about the European aspect of this, because obviously the situation right now in the Middle East is complex and interconnected. One of the issues is Israel. Now, we're hearing European calls to reconsider agreements when it comes with Israel. What legal mechanisms does the EU actually have to suspend or amend agreements? Because now there are strong calls from countries like Spain, Slovenia, and other countries who are saying they're going to apply international law when it comes to the Israeli issue.
Well, there's a very important issue when it comes to the separation of power within European law. Countries, when it comes to the certain aspects of their policy, especially foreign affairs, can act separately. But EU as a whole cannot just cancel by the headline any agreement. It needs to act through the law. The key framework here is EU-Israel Agreement Association, which was concluded under the Article 217 of the Treaty of the European Union. Like many other EU external agreements, it rests on respect of human rights and democratic principle as a very essential, I would even say, key element. So legally, EU may now initiate political review or consultation. They can suspend part cooperation program. They can amend protocols or trade preferences via agreement
The question
procedure.
would be, I mean, I understand what you're saying, that it is related to humanitarian law and, anything to do breaching laws that affect humans, basically gives them a legal way out. Is this correct in saying this? Like the EU can break or suspend deals with Israel based on the fact that the Israelis may possibly be, committing crimes against humanity, for instance?
Well, there is no simple answer, but the thing is that under Article 21 of the Tractate of the European Union, EU external action must promote democracy, rule of law, which is less glamorous as a slogan now. But the respect for international law this is very essential. Union is also bound by the trade agreement and security partnership and WTO rules, energy needs and humanitarian realities. So it tries to use the calibrated instruments of the diplomatic démarche, targeted sanction rather than blanket punishment, export control, funding conditionality, for instance, with the Horizon 2020, and exchange research protocols, human rights clauses in the agreement, and more importantly, it can as well use judicial oversight of Court of the Justice of the European Union. In the Cadi case law, which is very famous from this sanction policy, it can show that this might respect the due process. But the key thing is that EU foreign policy is relatively theoretical, but the politics is wearing a very strong legal seatbelt. So if the EU will decide to actually act in order to, let's say, check what possibilities that the presumption of violation of international humanitarian law will happen, it may use as well the Geneva Convention and customary law to find out whether there was, for instance, the breach of international human rights or war crimes in this context. So EU can really start doing something, but more. But it needs a global consensus within the member states.
So you're saying here that basically there is a balancing act, I suppose, between political pressure and our commitments towards the Israelis and legal commitments, because there are at least the ICJ and ICC has issued reports about Israeli actions in the last 2 or 3 years. So they have legal basis, I suppose, to cut off their arms supplies at least to the Israelis. Am I correct in saying that? But they're also under pressure because the Israelis are close allies to the EU member states.
Yes and no. I think the Israelis very much closer allies to US, and we can see growing, I would say, distance from the European states. But we can see here something more interesting when it comes to these actions. We can see that when it comes to the international law, those actions can potentially be under the violation of international law, because we need to find here legal classification that depends on evidence, context, and target status. Well, first of all, we will have applicable law when the conflict exists. Therefore, will be Geneva Convention and additional protocols, especially one, and customary international humanitarian law. The core principle will be distinction between civilians and combatants, prohibition of disproportional attacks, which might actually here happen, civilian objects protected unless military objective, which is Article 51 and 52, and Article 57, precaution in attack. When you look at the infrastructure targets, the energy grids, bridges, ports, telecom nodes may become lawfully military objective only if the effective contribution to military action will be established. Destruction offers definite military advantage. What we have to see, is it the case? And who can determine this? Who can actually show it? That might be, of course, domestic courts, military inquiries, and more importantly, they might be United Nations Commission on Inquiries, ICC, if of course jurisdiction is theirs, and International Court of Justice in interstate context. We have to see here that, for instance, United States is not a part of International Criminal Court. So my final conclusion here will be that in the war law, a breach is never just a breach. It's evidence, context, and consequences. as well from the military point of view, but as well from civilian, military, and humanitarian action point of view. And we need to remember about it, that it's not only an infrastructure, it's actually lives and dependence and critical infrastructure, for instance, from which, like electric grid, life can depend.
I'm glad you brought that up, that it's not, a clear-cut situation, and that there has to be, the international courts have to be involved, and tribunals and so forth. In the last few years, we have seen this, and there have been verdicts, or at least, recommendations that this is, in fact, acts of genocide and, acts, crimes against humanity and so forth. And there are arrest warrants on certain officials in Israel. Now, what role can these courts and tribunals realistically play when it comes to holding the Israelis accountable in these fast-moving conflicts? Given that it is basically just a recommendation, it's really up to nation states to suspend, for instance, the EU suspending arms deals or enacting these arrest warrants.
Well, when it comes to international criminal law, the courts are rarely emergency responders. We have to take into account. They are accountability institutions, so they do not act quick. What will act quickly would be, for instance, the special committee or a special envoy who will assess the situation. But the ICJ, International Court of Justice, hears dispute between states and can order provisional measures under the Article 41 of its statutes. The International Criminal Court prosecutors, they are can prosecute individual for the war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide where jurisdiction exists under the Rome Statute, which was the legal ground of International Court of International Criminal Court. Mm-hmm. The face real constraints is the concept of jurisdictions limits, enforcement gaps, evidence access problems, political resistance, and it's more importantly the time. But they still matter because they preserve evidence, they shape legal narrative, they clarify obligation, and impose reputational costs that outblast battlefield claims. Mm-hmm. So courts may not stop for the first strike, but they often write the less serious paragraph about it, and that's really important.
Okay, if we can head back to what's happening now in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, one of the main issues that's facing the world is energy. From the EU's perspective, how does energy security intersect when it comes to the legal obligations, especially when it comes to the supply chain disruptions coming from the Strait?
Well, when it comes to this issue, we have to look at the very important fact that for the EU, energy security now sits at the crossroads of international law and international markets, foreign policy, customer protection, strategic and autonomy, and the problems which we can see in the various regions within the EU and with the EU borderlands and EU partnership countries. So when we look at the legal basis in the Treaty of the European Union, Article 1944, if I'm correct, there is highlighted the support of functioning of energy markets and security of supplies, efficiency and renewables, and interconnection of network, which is extremely important now. This is the creation and the legal ground of interconnected trans-European networks. In a Hormuz disruption, the EU might consider, therefore, coordinated use of strategic reserves, which EU has itself, within the framework of cooperation of European states, diversification on suppliers and routes. As we can see now, Ukraine is actually reigniting and resurrecting the pipeline from part of the Russia. We can see emergency solidarity measures between member states. So one member state of the EU is helping another, and temporary state aid support under the Article 107 and 108, which means that countries can help the actors from the economic markets of their own, in order to ensure that they are not vanishing due to the problems related to inflation or the surge of the economic cost of the fuels, for instance, and implication. Well, another thing is sanction compliance reviews that they can use, and price stabilization and consumer protection tool. Well, this is something which is happening even now. For instance, in some countries of the European Union, there is official state information about maximum level of the price, for instance, of diesel, of petrol, or benzene.
Yes.
And it's actually showing us how much they say. Well, the legal challenge is always balancing emergency flexibility with long-term competition rules and climate commitments.
Yes, your point is clear, but unfortunately we're running out of time here. But thank you so much for joining us this morning from Brussels. That was Kamila Zahareta-Romanowska, an EU law professor. Thank you for joining us this morning here on Qnews. Thank you so much. And for more news updates, we head back to Ronald Kassos in our studio.
Thank you very much, Rehem, for your in-depth analysis. And a U.S. official has said that Donald Trump is prepared to consider a short extension of the ceasefire with Iran. A U.S. source familiar with the matter told Reuters that U.S. President Donald Trump is ready to consider extending the ceasefire with Iran for an additional 3 to 5 days. The source stressed that the ceasefire would not remain open-ended, indicating a limited window for diplomatic progress. U.S. Central Command has said it has redirected 31 vessels as part of its ongoing maritime blockade measures against Iran. The United States Central Command added that its forces have redirected 31 vessels either back to ports or onto new routes as part of the ongoing maritime restrictions linked to Iran. In a post on X, it added that most of the affected ships were oil tankers.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين.
وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
The United Nations says diplomacy remains the only sustainable way to resolve the Lebanon-Israeli conflict. UN spokesperson Stephanie Dujarric warned that the situation along the border remains fragile, while humanitarian conditions in Gaza and the West Bank continue to worsen. He called on all sides to de-escalate and ensure full access for aid, stressing that there is no military solution and that negotiations are the only viable path forward. Widespread condemnation has followed an image appearing to show an Israeli soldier desecrating a crucifix in southern Lebanon. The photo, verified by Reuters, is taken in the village of Dibel, shows a soldier striking a fallen sculpture of Jesus with an axe. The incident has drawn criticism from Israeli officials, the United States and church leaders. The Israeli military says in its investigating as concerns grow over respect for religious sites and its ongoing tensions in the region.
Was shocking. We were heartened to see that, at least from the reports, that disciplinary measures was taken very quickly against the soldiers.
What is the Secretary General reaction to the image of Israeli soldiers?
France said that a second French UN peacekeeper has died from injuries sustained in an attack in southern Lebanon. French President Emmanuel Macron added that a second French soldier serving with UNIFIL has died from wounds sustained in an attack in southern Lebanon. He also added that the soldier passed away on Wednesday morning, raising the local French fatalities from the incident in the town of Grand Doureia to 2. That brings us to the end of this bulletin, but before we go, here's a look at the top headlines making news at this hour. Trump says no deadline for Iran deal. Iran says open to dialogue and warns blockades and threats hinder talks. Finally, UN says diplomacy only sustainable path to resolve Lebanon-Israeli conflict. That brings us to the end of this bulletin. Thank you very much for watching Q News, your window to the latest developments from across the region and around the world. Thank you very much.